Can you take me through, and let's just hit pause on this moment, because I don't know, other than the Mattis resignation letter for cause over the troop withdrawal in Syria, I don't know if 4 senior national security or law enforcement officials who have resigned since Trump has been there. Take me through the impact to the Justice Department and the people who remain of the 4 career prosecutors who resigned from the case. One, Mr. Kravis resigning from the department altogether in what was described to me by a former DOJ official as a very clear statement that he did not want to be a part of the Barr Justice Department anymore.
Yeah, highly, highly unusual, Nicolle. I can't think of a similar situation in which prosecutors en masse in uniform stepped away from a case. And what's so troubling here is not that there was a disagreement. That happens all the time. Please understand that. I mean, we fight among ourselves in our offices all the time about the appropriate way to recommend something to a judge or introduce evidence or bring charges. What happened here is that after the prosecutors filed their sentencing memorandum recommending, by the way, a sentence within the guidelines, a wholly normal sentence within the guidelines for the judge to consider, they were then asked to do it over, to do it again, to be more lenient, based upon the president's concern about how his personal friend and protector would be treated in federal court. That's what's so odd about this thing. And I hate the notion that these prosecutors were put in a situation where they felt they had no choice but to resign. But frankly, I'm proud of them. There are really 2 choices when you're faced with this sort of dilemma in government. You can abide by an order or you can resign. And they chose to resign. And I think that was the honorable thing for them to do.
It was suggested to me that Maine DOJ likely signed off on the recommendations, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. Nobody goes rogue. As you said, the sentencing guidelines dictate most of this, not a lot of wiggle room in there. So when they recommended 7 to 9 years, one, it was within the guidelines, as you just said, and it was signed off on by Maine DOJ. Is there anything else other than the president's tweet that could have, I mean, I'm just trying to rule out anything other than political pressure from the president?
Look, it's entirely possible that somebody in the Department of Justice thought that this recommendation was too stringent, that it was too severe. I get that. As I said earlier, we do argue among ourselves about the appropriate way to dispense justice. That, by the way, is healthy. I don't know if there was a miscommunication or a misunderstanding, but the bottom line is that once the president tweeted that the case was a miscarriage of justice and that Mr. Stone had been treated horribly, it then puts the department in a terrible box. And here's why, Nicolle. We have to be 2 things in the Department of Justice. We have to be actually objectively fair, and we have to be perceived as fair. And so even if the outcome is actually objectively fair, and the judge will see to it that it is, there's now a perception that the president has put his very large thumb on the scale. And that means that it won't be perceived as fair. She's in a box too, the federal judge. It'll either look like she is capitulating to the president or that she is rebuffing the president, when in fact all she's going to do is what she's done her entire time on the bench, which is be a smart, thoughtful, independent jurist, which is precisely what we want. The damage is not necessarily in the outcome. The damage is in the perception of the outcome.
We're really careful not to run Trump sound unless there's a real important reason to do so. And the important reason today was that he left open the possibility that he'll ultimately pardon Roger Stone. How would that land? I mean, the 4 prosecutors who brought the case have already resigned from the department. But a pardon for Roger Stone, who was charged, sat trial, found guilty. What signal does that send inside the department?
Well, if the president is really concerned about a miscarriage of justice, Nicolle, a pardon would be it. Look, pardons are acts of grace, right, of presidential grace, and always, in the past at least, the people who have earned them, with a couple of exceptions here and there where presidents, I think, issued ill-considered pardons and commutations. But by and large, it's for people who have served their sentence, who have led a good life since they have been released from incarceration, and who have earned this grace. And so the notion that the president would weigh in yet again with a pardon or commutation for Mr. Stone will not be well received at the Department of Justice. Look, we get it. We understand that the Constitution vests in the president this plenary power to issue pardons and commutations, but this will be seen as a real miscarriage of justice, and I think will be deeply, deeply insulting to the men and women, prosecutors and agents who do the work of the Department of Justice every day across this country.
Carol Lee, you've got some brand new reporting that broke last night. Take us through it. It's about the president and the attorney general getting involved here in the sentencing phase, not just for Stone, but also for Mike Flynn. Explain.
That's right, Nicolle. In our reporting, officials laid out basically what they described as a broader pattern of Attorney General Barr moving in to take control of legal matters within the Justice Department that are of personal interest to the president, and that they've said that this has escalated in the last couple of weeks and point to three specific things. One is the change in the Flynn sentencing recommendation. Sources told us that there was a lot of pressure that was put on the prosecutors after they filed a sentencing recommendation in early January that was said jail time, possible jail time of up to 6 months for him. 2 weeks later, on January 29th, the Justice Department, the government came back and said, no, we think, probation will be fine for Mike Flynn. We ignore what we said earlier. We're told there was a lot of pressure in those 2 weeks in between there for that to happen from senior officials at the Justice Department. And then the next day, you saw Attorney General Barr install a loyalist to him in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., which handles and oversees a number of cases that are important to President Trump, the Flynn case, the Roger Stone case, and then inquiries into what the president sees as adversaries at the former FBI Director James Comey and former Deputy Director Andrew McCabe. And then more recently, yesterday, we saw what happened with Roger Stone. And so what officials are saying is that you take all of these things together and you're seeing a sort of an attorney general who is moving in as sort of power grab to try to get control of cases that typically would be independent of the White House, but in this instance are very important to President Trump, and he wants to be able to put his thumb on the scale on those.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.